Hello, family heads, and welcome to another installment of Family Vacation, the show in between the series. I'm your host, Matt Glass, and today I'm going to be very upfront with you. A lot of you are going to disagree with my opinion on this episode, and that's okay. I've had a lot of shit takes in the past that I've sort of revisited and ended up kind of remedying for myself. However, with this episode, I want to start backpedaling on my opinions and my observations a little less. And I figured I would do so by talking about an album that pretty much ran itself into the ground straight away from its release. You already saw by the title, we're talking about Panic at the Disco's Viva Las Vengeance. Released on August 19th of 2022 through Fueled by Ramen and DCD2, this is the 7th and final studio album under the name Panic at the Disco. On this record, Brendon Urie had attempted to reminisce on his 17-year-long career in music by tackling themes such as turbulent romance, jaded views about show business, and the general idea of being worn down like a machine. Though the record had been well received by music critics in its early stages, many new and old Panic fans alike had taken the internet by storm to discuss at length how the album is not only a betrayal of the overall sound, but how it should have been labeled as Brendon's solo album, and not under the name of the band, since Brendon had been the only original member of the band since 2015. Okay, now, let me start off by telling you why I'm talking about this, besides the fact that it's an old album week. Family heads, I came to the realization a week or two ago that I just might be starting to get old. And old people like to be nostalgic about the past. So in my tour de taste, I decided to re-listen to some classic bands popular in my heyday, such as The Dead Bachelor themselves. I actually had started listening to Panic in the Brendon phase. I was quite fond of Death of a Bachelor, which you already heard from the episode me and AJ did, and it prompted me to enjoy his follow-up album, Pray for the Wicked. When 4 years later they had released this record, I was highly disappointed in its execution because I was a fan of the rather grandiose production of its predecessors. However, I was surprised to see in this re-listen that some things had changed and a few observations could be made. And now, I'm about to share some takes that are rather uncomfortable to say, but I'm going to rip it off like a band-aid. So here we go. Number 1. I think that this record, Viva Las Vengeance by Panic at the Disco, may be overhated. It's no secret that a lot of people really hate this record, but I personally find that there are some upsides. Some upsides. But not only do I think that this album is overhated, I think that this album is hated for everything else besides what's actually on the album. I know. These may fall under the category of my worst takes yet on this podcast surrounding an album. But before I continue, let me make two things perfectly clear. First, I don't condone or endorse any of Brendon Urie's past behavior or the past behavior of his bandmates, his staff members, or anyone else that led to the pool of allegations that surrounded the band. I knew the controversy of the band at a cursory glance, but the more and more I looked into it, the worse and worse it got. I'm talking videos, past statements, and stuff behind the scenes that was really ugly, including disputes between the bandmates. And unfortunately, Brendon just kinda left a trail of it behind him for the internet to just really follow it and swat him down before he can do anything else with his career. Not that his career was really on the rise, because he kind of rose rather quickly, as many of you know with the high hopes situation. I am, with some heavy conditions, a believer in separating the art from the artist in some situations. However, in this review, I'm going to be talking a little bit about the star's overall reception in the later years of Panic, and why I think it not only fed into the disdain of the band, but why all that reception kinda added to my overall listening experience. The second thing that I need to clarify is that I don't think this album is perfect or even really that good by any means. There are many flaws within the album that I will discuss, but there's also some things about the album that I think it did okay. And dare I say, surprisingly well. Instead of my 5-point category checklist, I'm just going to say some pros and cons. Let's start with some of the good parts. I think this record has a lot of raw emotion in its slower tracks. Many of the lyrics all across the board talk about being worn down and battered by personal relationships as well as the music industry. In a place that Brendon was in, such as this one, where he was getting attacked on all fronts, I felt that he articulated his sadness and loneliness well, especially on tracks such as Don't Let the Light Go Out, which talks about heartbreak, and the dramatic truth of processing hate alone on All By Yourself. The second pro I was going to say was that I think that the production on this record actually kind of works. People view it as a departure from the last two records, but I really think that if Brendan continued the way he was going with the over the top process production of Pray for the Wicked and Death of a Bachelor, he would have landed himself an even worse reception. I also think the fact that the band recorded this in the studio at the same time kind of adds to the living factor of this record. The record may not be that good overall, but at least they tried. Speaking of them, musicians. I think the musicianship is actually pretty good. The guitars and drums really work overtime, like on songs Sugar Soaker and God Killed Rock and Roll, with, the Elvis like instrumental and the anthemic stadium sounding hook and the soulful slowdown. I even like the theatrically Baroque texture on songs like Say It Louder and Something About Maggie. It feels like a lot of the songs have momentum, and you gotta give them that. I think if we're talking about all the good things, I'm glad that they didn't just try to phone it in or they didn't just try to meet a quota. There obviously was a level of give a shit that was on this record. Finally, I would say that the juxtaposition of the song's theme being in contrast with the instrumentation, I found that a lot of it was done pretty well. Listening to tracks such as the title track, Viva Las Vengeance, I found that he does a good job trying to talk about how he's trying to move forward despite being swatted down in every direction. This is repeated by the whole motif, which you can hear actually at the end, kind of bookending the album, shut up and go to bed. I'm not saying what he did was good, but he really tried in spite of all the controversy that he caused for himself. As much as I wanted to try and find some upsides with this album for what it did well, there are, unfortunately, quite a few cons. The first one, the lyrics on most of the songs, if not all of them, are really not that good and are filled with very half-witted references to literature and some pop culture stuff. I'd give you an example. It's all over. It's literally all over. Listen to like any of the tracks that are on this record, you will find at least one. I think they mentioned the Dead Kennedys at one point. Second con, while I don't necessarily think his voice is terrible on the album, I do think hitting high notes being the biggest grab factor of each track on this record gets really, really, really old. The track Sad Clown is probably the biggest example on this record in that regard. It's also my second least favorite. I'm fine with him hitting high notes. He does it in his live performances, and hey, if you got the vocal chops, show it off. But Sad Clown, come on, man. Let's be real. A third con, there are way too many key changes throughout the album that really just don't fit whatsoever. And they are so jarring that sometimes the choruses just sound completely different than what the verses are supposedly leading you up to. I think this was done to try and make the album sound very different, but the amount of times I thought the songs were going to stay in one key and it switched to something completely different really threw me for a loop. Some examples of this include Local God, Sad Clown, Middle of a Breakup, and even the title track Viva Las Vengeance, though that and the last one kind of grew on me a little bit more. I think they were really trying to emulate a lot of Queen's arranging styles, but they really should have tried and stayed in their lane, or at least committed to that enough where it didn't make the album sound so bananas. Speaking of bananas, my next con. One of their songs is so bad that it's its own con in general. The song Star Spangled Banger is one of the worst songs I've ever heard in my entire life. He obviously wanted it to be a single. I feel like he wrote this to try and replicate the same idea of this anthemic sort of thing that everybody's gonna be pumping their fists and singing like New Americana by Halsey. But in its execution, it sounded like if OK Go wrote for an educational kids show like Schoolhouse Rock. It just felt silly and really on the nose. My next point, this album is tonally confusing in many areas. So the last big point that I have is that this album's flow is all over the place and kind of uneven. Not in terms of the track length, because all the songs are relatively on the shorter side, but more like in how they're grouped together on the record. I'm going to kind of talk about each song for like a couple seconds, and just tell you the theme of why it feels weird to listen to. You start off with Viva Las Vengeance, which is about him performing and feeling miserable because he has to kind of just keep rolling with the punches of both his fan base and the music industry with the motif of shut up and go to bed. Cool. That's a really dynamic way to start the record. Then you have two songs about relationships. First one's called Middle of a Breakup, where he talks about how the best kind of sex is the sex you have when you're in an on and off relationship, makeup sex, which kind of has a toxic way of painting it. But then you have another one right after that called Don't Let the Light Go Out, which is about not bearing the thought of the person leaving. But it's like, okay, which is it? We on again, off again, or are you gone for good? Like it just feels weird to have those on top of each other. Then you have some of the more anthemic section on the record. You got Local God, Star Spangled Banger, which I mentioned I really hate, a soulful one called God Killed Rock and Roll, which I can hear the Queen influence on this one, and a later track. You got Say It Louder, which kind of has the more emo pop feel, but is still very anthemic and rock like. You got Sugar Soaker, which kind of sounds like an Elvis song. I'm talking like Las Vegas Elvis. Then you got Something About Maggie, which is the other Queen like song. But after this whole rock section, where you sort of see this harking back of stadium rock origins, you get to Sad Clown, which is just not a good song. That one's another Queen-like song, and frankly, it just falls flat and feels weird because it's supposed to start off the next section where it's Lonely Brendan again. But this time, this Lonely Brendan is not relationship Brendan. It's actually performer Brendan, like in Viva Las Vengeance. After Sad Clown, it's All By Yourself and Do It to Death, where All By Yourself is another kind of ballady track like Don't Let the Light Go Out, and Do It to Death is another upbeat song pretty much saying the same exact thing as Viva Las Vengeance. It just feels like the tracks aren't at all in sync with one another in any way. It feels like he just grouped together the tracks that are alike in some way and just kind of left it there, but it feels weird. It just felt weird because it felt like he was trying to tell a story, but not a cohesive one or a really well written one. So that was kind of the biggest thing with this record that made it a little bit of a slog to get through. I also felt like, as a little sidebar, that this album is highly misleading based off of the first track. I mean, you know you're going to get into something that's interesting with this record, but it almost feels like Brendan was trying to coax the audience into thinking that the old Panic was back with Viva Las Vengeance. But the reality is that it just meanders instead of committing to one sound, which really kind of annoyed me. If he committed to the stadium rock and the Queen, if he committed to the loneliness, if he committed to the emo pop, that would be a different story. But it almost feels like the album was made to try and appeal to all eras of Panic, but it didn't work at all. Instead, it just sounded like a bunch of unfinished Panic demos. As you can see, there are plenty of flaws with Viva Las Vengeance, so I don't want to go forward and say that the record is by any means like a great record. However, I think there was some credit in the pros that I mentioned that, despite the placement of the songs, kind of lent itself to try and give it a fighting chance. There are many reasons for not liking this album that are valid, and those were just the ones in the cons section that were the biggest issues for me. However, before I get to my final thoughts, there is another matter of discussion on this record that I felt needed to be brought up on the podcast. If you think back to this moment in time when the album was released, it was a really dicey moment for Brendan as he landed himself in some pretty hot water. Social media played the biggest hand in uncovering some of the rather disturbing statements that are on video and behind the scenes that were said by the star, and it took the internet by storm as he was beginning to rise in popularity with High Hopes and Me with Taylor Swift. But I think fans were quite uncomfortable with him rising to this level of popularity and mainstream success, not only for the controversial statements, but also for the betrayal of elements and overall musical sound just to appeal to the masses. If you think of High Hopes, it sounds nothing like any of the other songs that Panic has done, not even on Death of a Bachelor, which is arguably one of the most successful Panic at the Disco record. All these things are very valid points for hating Brendan and the band. Not this album, though. I say again, it's hard to separate the art from the artist, and in this day and age, rationalization becomes almost impossible for many artists who land themselves in controversy. So I'm not saying you need to like the album or the artist. However, as somebody who considers themselves a music critic, I wanted to try and research why this album was so badly received. And I gotta say, I don't think this album deserves a myriad of praise or that it doesn't deserve the hate it gets, but the reasons I heard from a lot of music reviewers as to why the album is bad were super unreliable because they didn't actually talk about the album's contents. The reviews from content creators of all different platforms were so avoidant in getting into the nitty gritty that they were almost maddening to listen to. Every single review only wanted to take time to hop on the shit on Brendan train, which, whatever, that's fine. But they were doing this by disguising it as a review of this album so they could just keep going with the trend and have a stake in the game. I heard people talking about his live vocals, his allegations, how annoying High Hopes and Me were, and even the music videos not being very good. None of these have anything to do with the recording of the album that's in front of them. I understand they might play into it to some extent through expectations and such, but they should be kept out of reviews of what's right there, what you're hearing on this record. So frankly, I felt like I wanted to acknowledge it since it's had some time to die out. It was hot on social media to hate Brendan, but now that it's somewhat dissipated, I wanted to maybe end on some food for thought. Remember that if you're going to dislike something a lot of other people dislike or dare I say even hate, make sure you agree and that you aren't doing it to just hop on a bandwagon. I think we're all kind of guilty of that in this album. It's even alright to form an opposite opinion and voice them, but just don't agree for the sake of agreeing, especially if the reasoning is not even tangentially related. Sorry for that little venting sesh, family heads, but I think it was just sort of a matter of anti-trend that really ran this album into the ground. Because otherwise, I think it's kind of the best fighting chance it had given the nature of where the albums were going. With that though, this record is going to get a solid D and a 4 out of 10. I've battled with this record enough in writing this review, but I concluded that this album is not very well done like all the other reviews had kinda mentioned. However, I'm going to walk away knowing that these points I made were done thoroughly. I would say the best songs on here are Sugar Soaker, God Killed Rock and Roll, the very earnest Don't Let the Light Go Out, and All By Myself, because at least they're ballads, and most of the time ballads can't really go wrong. And I would say that the worst tracks are Local God and Star Spangled Banger. They are two of the most annoying songs I've ever heard. Oh, and Sad Clown. You can't forget Sad Clown. Well, family heads, if my opinions haven't driven you away, thank you so much for staying for this episode. I put a lot of time and thought and energy into writing it so that I can articulate my thoughts very well and not just hop on the shit on Brendan train. Thank you guys so much for listening as always. And AJ, you're on next week. Peace!